오늘 제가 말씀드릴 주제는 대한민국의 수많은 시험들이 무엇을 진짜 평가하고 있는가에 대한 겁니다. 최근에 제가 출판을 한 두 가지 책에 기반을 하는데요. 첫 번째는 서울대에서 누가 A+를 받는가는 처음부터 서울대 교육이 문제가 있다고 생각해서 접근한 연구가 아닙니다. 그냥 서울대에 들어간 그 공신으로 불리는 애들조차도 서울대에서 너무 공부하는 게 어렵다라는 말들이 많아서, 하소연이 많아서 더 열심히 해 그랬더니 해도 안 돼요. 어떻게 해야 되는지 모르겠어요. 이런 안타까운 하소연이 너무 많아서, 그러면은 해서 된 애들, 성적 좋은 애들, 그런 애들의 공부법을 추출해서 다른 학우들에게 신입생 오리엔테이션 때 틀어주고 나눠주면 좋겠다, 이런 생각으로 해서 시작을 했습니다. 그런데 학생들의 공부법을 도저히 다른 학우들에게 이렇게 공부해라라고 말할 수가 없는 결과가 나와서, 결국은 왜 그렇게 공부를 하는지에 대한 궁극적인 이유가 그것이 그렇게 평가되고 있기 때문에, 그렇게 공부를 해야만 성적을 잘 받을 수 있기 때문이라는 결론에 도달을 해서, 결국은 대한민국 교육에 문제가 있다면 그 문제의 궁극적인 끝에는 평가가 있구나, 대한민국의 시험을 바꾸지 않으면 대한민국의 교육을 바꿀 수가 없겠구나, 이런 결론이 들어서 이제 앞에 책은 대학 교육을 중심으로 썼다면 뒤에 책은 우리 공교육의 해결을 위해서 쓰기 시작을 했습니다. 간단히 말씀드리면, 서울대에 A+를 받는 4.0 이상인 46명을 심층 인터뷰를 하고, 그리고 1,100명이 넘는 학생들에게 양적으로도 확인을 한 이런 연구 결과는 여러 가지 학생들의 일반적인 특징 중에서, 물론 공부 잘하고 하는 학생들은 더 끈기 있고 더 열심히 하고 더 벼락치기를 덜 하고, 이런 특징은 전 세계의 공통적인 일반적인 특징이에요. 근데 그거 말고 특히 서울대 내에서 그들 사이에서의 더 아주 결정적인 GPA 팩터는 얼마나 더 수용적이면 수용적이냐, 더 수용적이면 수용적일수록 A 학점이 높고요, 더 비판적이고 창의적일수록 학점이 낮아요. 그러니까 그런 공부 방법, 수용적인 공부 방법이라 하면 이제 교수님 말씀을 한마디도 빼놓지 않고 다 받아 적는다. 근데 이게 재밌는 거는 키워드나 요점 정리를 하면 안 되고, 말을 문장의 형태로 토시 하나 빠지지 않게 다 받아 적고 그래야지만 된다라는 이런 연구 결과가 나왔습니다. 교수님의 관점, 교수님의 논리, 교수님의 논리의 흐름, 교수님의 용어, 그걸 그대로 카피해야 된다라는 그런 학생들의 얘기를 듣고, 저는 연구자는 편견을 가지면 안 되는데 저는 편견이 있었어요. 분명히 전공별로 다를 것이다. 그런데 음대, 미대까지 전부 다 더 수용적이면 수용적일수록 학점이 높고, 더 비판적이고 창의적이면 학점이 낮은 그런 현상은 모든 전공에 똑같았습니다. 이게 그 그래프고요. 학점 1,111명의 그래프고요. 자기가 수용적이냐, 비판적이냐, 창의적이냐 이런 걸 물었을 때 이 긴 바가 수용적이다라는 답변이었거든요. 근데 이렇게 훨씬 더 수용적인 학생들이 일반적으로 많았고, 그런 애들 중에서 특히 이게 더 수용적이다라고 응답한 학생들 중에서 학점에 따른 구분이에요. 그러니까 학점이 높으면 높을수록 더 수용적이다라는 응답이 많았다는 얘기입니다. 누군가는 이렇게 말할 수 있습니다. 이제까지 우리 그래도 그게 주입식이든 뭐든 간에 이렇게 공부를 해서 우리나라 이만큼 경제 발전을 했고 우리나라 이만큼 컸는데 사실 뭐가 문제냐, 아주 문제가 없는 건 아닐 수 있지만 그래도 이런 교육 필요하지 않냐라고 주장을 하시는 분들 있을 수 있습니다. 지식에는 4가지 종류가 있습니다. 누군가는 사과나무에서 사과가 떨어지는 걸 궁금하게 만드는 교육을 합니다. 우리 교육은 사과나무에서 사과가 떨어지는 걸 궁금하게 만들 수 있을까요? 사과나무에서 사과가 떨어지면 그거를 막 생각하고 이리저리 고민하고 온갖 프로세스를 거쳐서 만유인력 법칙이라는 생성적 지식을 만들어냅니다. 이후에 수많은 다른 지식들을 제너레이팅을 하기 때문에 생성적 지식이라고 합니다. 누군가는 이런 생성적 지식 몇 개를 모아다가 롤러코스터를 만듭니다. 그런 지식을 응용적 지식이라고 합니다. 이런 생성적 지식과 응용적 지식까지는 굉장히 비판적이고 창의적인 사고력이 요구가 됩니다. 그런데 누군가는 롤러코스터를 만든 지식을 갖다가 대량 생산을 하는 데 씁니다. 그 대량 생산을 하는 데 쓰는 데 필요한 지식이 제조적 지식입니다. 제조업을 하는. 그런데 이런 제조적 지식에는 물건의 제품의 하자가 없고 품질의 이상이 없고 에러가 없고 오류가 없고 차질이 없는 거, 똑같이 하는 거, 있는 그대로 하는 거, 이런 게 굉장히 중요합니다. 그래서 수용적인 학습 능력이 이런 데에서 각광을 발휘할 수 있습니다. 우리는 이 제조적 지식으로 경제 발전을 했습니다. 누군가는 롤러코스터 대량 생산된 것 중에서 한 대를 사다가 놀이동산에 심고 그거의 작동법을 익히는 매뉴얼적 지식을 필요로 하기도 합니다. 그런 매뉴얼적 지식을 필요로 하는 사회는 아마도 한국전쟁 직후 정도의 사회가 됐을 겁니다. 사회는 이미 응용적 생성적 지식을 필요로 하는 산업구조로 바뀌었는데, 그런데 인재들은 제조적 지식으로 무장을 한 채 나옵니다. 그래서 사상 최악의 취업난인데 기업에서는 인재가 없다고 아우성입니다. 이 미스매치가 굉장히 심각한 사회 문제를 일으키고 있습니다. 초중고등학교뿐만 아니라 대학교의 교육은 사실상 속도보다 방향이 중요한데 우리는 엉뚱한 방향으로 전 국민이 전력 질주하는 속도전을 벌이고 있습니다. 누군가는 피사에서 그래도 우리나라가 나름 최상위권이니까 괜찮게 하는 거 아니냐 이러는데, 피사는 전 세계적으로 딱 15살 때만 보는 시험입니다. 15살의 나이대에 배우는 정도는요, 전 국민이 선행을 하는 우리나라 같은 경우는 비판적 창의적 사고도 마치 조금 앞서 있는 것처럼 착시 효과를 일으키는 입문 단계의 교육입니다. 우리나라가 올림피아드 무슨 수학과학 전 세계 제패하는 수준으로 보면 노벨상 수십 명 나왔어요. 정상입니다. 그런데 우리나라가 막 공부를 잘한다, 애들이 뭐 세계적, 그거 다 어디까지냐면 대학 입학까지입니다. 왜냐하면 똑같이 OECD에서 한 피악을 보면은, 이거는 피악은 15살이 아니라 25살에서 65세까지 성인들 대상으로 하는데 바로 OECD 평균 이하로 뚝 떨어집니다. 많은 사람들이 자기주도 학습이 명문대를 가기 위한 전략이라고 주장을 하지만 사실상 우리나라에서 자기가 자기 러닝 컨텐츠를 발굴해서 자기의 러닝을 주도하면서 하는 그런 애들이 얼마나 될까요? 사실상 자기 관리 학습에 능한 학생들이 명문대를 가고 있는 현실입니다. 이러다 보니까 이제 학생들이 중간에 가서 길을 잃고 성찰할 시간이 없어서 대입병이라는 병에 걸려서 이게 사회 이슈가 돼서 다큐멘터리까지 나왔습니다. 이 대입병은 바닥을 치는, 그러니까 대학교 2학년 때 자신감, 자존감 이런 게 바닥을 쳐서 무력감, 중간에 좌절하고 이런 사회적인 현상을 얘기를 합니다. 지금 이 다큐의 주인공이 작년 수능 만점 받아서 서울대 경영학과 간 학생입니다. 이게 굉장히 많이 있고요. 그래서 이제 제가 드리는 질문은 그렇습니다. 정말 우리 사회에서 대입에 성공했다고 한 애들을 진짜 성공이라고 볼 수 있느냐, 혹은 대학에서 성공했다고 한 애들을 진짜 성공이라고 볼 수 있느냐, 이런 성공이 진짜 성공이냐, 이런 질문. 그리고 오늘도 그렇고 어제도 그렇고 하루 종일 여러분들이 듣고 경험하신 얘기는 세상이 바뀌고 있고 우리는 새로운 능력을 길러야 되는데, 그 새로운 능력에 많은 분들이 얘기를 하시죠. 비판적이고 창의적이고 협업 능력, 커뮤니케이션 능력, 이런 것들을 길러주고 있느냐라고 질문을 드릴 수 있습니다. 그리고 수많은 교육이 리더를 기르고자 하는데 정말 리더를 기르는 것이냐, 아니면 정말 말 잘 듣는 관리자 수준을 기르는 것이 목표인 것이냐, 이런 질문이 제기가 될 수 있습니다. 특히 대부분의 명문 대학들은 비판적이고 창의적인, 그리고 글로벌 리더십, 글로벌 커뮤니케이션, 협업 능력을 가진 인재를 기른다고 거의 대부분 교육 목표는 써 있습니다. 그런데 그런 게 교육 목표고요. 근데 학생들의 반응은 굉장히 수용적인 학습자가 A+를 받잖아요, 지금. 근데 이 결과가 목표하고 다른데, 이 결과와 목표의 이 차이를 모니터링하는 시스템이 대학에도 없고 대한민국에도 없습니다. 얼마 전에 서울대의 한 교수님께서 이제 책을 읽고서 저한테 얘기를 하신 얘기가 있는데, 서울대에서 20년 동안 가르쳤답니다. 근데 매번 채점을 할 때 내 의견과 비슷하게 썼으면 얘는 수업을 잘 들었구나, 그래서 점수를 주고, 말이 되긴 하지만 내 의견과 다른 의견을 쓰면 얘 뭐지? 이런 생각이 들어서 깎았답니다. 그런데 이게 학생들의 다양성과 창의성을 누른다는 생각을 20년 동안 단 한 번도 해본 적이 없답니다. 왜냐하면 내 의견이랑 비슷하게 써야지만 공부를 한 것 같다라고 믿어왔다는 겁니다. 이게 굉장히 중요합니다. 많은 선생님들이 내가 한 거랑 비슷하게 하면, 내가 한 거랑 동일하게 하면 그러면 얘는 공부를 했구나라고 생각을 해서 거기에 적절하다는 보상을 줍니다. 그런 평가 시스템이 현재 있는데, 틀리지는 않았지만 다른 의견에 대해서는 우리는 얼마나 지금 어떻게 평가를 하고 있는지에 대한 질문을 사실은 아무도 하지 않고 있습니다. 어떤 선생님께서는 제가 전공 과목은 굉장히 할 게 많은데 교양 과목 중에 비판적 사고와 창의적 글쓰기라는 과목이 있어요. 그러니까 비판과 창의 중요한 거 알겠으니 비판과 창의는 거기서 배우고 제 과목에서는 전공 수업만 하면 안 됩니까? 이런 질문을 합니다. 비판과 창의는요, 연습과 훈련에 의해서 길러질 수 있는 능력입니다. 타고나서 바꿀 수 없는 게 아니고요. 근데 그게 특징적인 게 지네릭한 어빌리티가 아닙니다. 범용적으로 과학에서 비판과 창의가 길러졌는데 그게 문학으로 전이되지 않습니다. 기계공학에서 비판과 창의가 음악으로 전이되지 않습니다. 막 여기를 이렇게 막 운동을 했는데 여기에 이두박근 삼두박근이 생기지 어느 날 갑자기 허벅지 대퇴부에 살이 붙지 않습니다. 그래서 선진 좋은 훌륭한 평가라고 불리는 것들은 전 과목에서 비판과 창의를 하고 전 과목에서 논술을 하고 그렇게 진행을 합니다. 영역 특정적인 능력이라는 거고요. 제가 교차 실험을 해봤습니다. IB를 꺼내는 수업을 많이 한다고 알려진 인터내셔널 바칼로레아 학생들에게 한국 수능을 준비 없이 한번 보게 해봤고요. 한국 수능을 보는 학생들에게 IB 시험을 보게 해봤습니다. IB 시험을 본 학생들 중에서 혹시 개인의 능력 때문에 시험을 못 봤다라는 변수가 들어갈까 봐 걱정이 돼서 이미 그 옥스퍼드나 캠브리지나 홍콩대나 서울대보다 랭킹 높은데 합격한 학생들을 대상으로 실험을 진행을 했습니다. 결과는 한국 수능에서 1등급 한 명도 없었고요. 그리고 캠브리지 공대 합격한 학생도 수학이 반타작이었습니다. 왜 그랬냐? 한국 수학은 계산기, 마트에서 1,000원이면 살 수 있는 계산기처럼 계산을 시간 내에 정확하게 하는 능력이 평가 기준에 포함되어 있고, 여기 수학은 3차원 그래프가 나오는 공학용 계산기를 활용해서 얼마나 자유자재로 그걸 능수능란하게 활용을 해서 그 너머의 생각을 하느냐가 수학의 평가 기준에 포함되어 있습니다. 그래서 1,000원짜리 계산기처럼 하는 계산을 잘 못합니다. 그래서 성적이 떨어진 것 같습니다. 이 IB 학생들 중에 대답이 수학은 당연히 푸는 방법이 여러 가지가 아닌가요? 그런데 문제를 봤는데 이렇게 긴 지문에 내가 어떤 방법으로 풀었는지는 고려하지 않고 그렇게 막 풀었는데 보기가 1번 61, 2번 62, 3번 63, 4번 64, 5번 65였대요. 그렇게 길게 풀다가 더하기 1만 틀려도 그냥 틀리는 게 대한민국에서 말하는 객관식 시험의 공정입니까? 라고 되물었습니다. 한국 학생들에게 IB를 시험을 보게 했는데요. 충남교육청의 지원을 받아서 그 내신 등급별로 다른 그룹으로 해서 시험을 봤습니다. 근데 이구동성으로 학생들이 하는 얘기가 한국의 논술과 굉장히 달라요. 그래서 한국의 논술과 어떻게 다르냐 그랬더니 이것도 다 논서술형인데 한국의 논술은 출제자의 의도와 채점자의 기대를 예측해서 쓰는 사실상 정답이 정해져 있는 객관식의 또 다른 형태일 뿐입니다 라고 아이들이 이구동성으로 얘기를 했습니다. 그리고 학생들이 신기하다, 새롭다, 낯설다, 어렵다, 그런데 재미있다 이런 얘기를 합니다. 그래서 왜 재미있냐 그랬더니 틀리든 말든 일단 내 생각을 쓰는 거잖아요. 학교에서는 사실상 내 생각을 쓰는 것이 자유롭게 기회가 주어진 적이 없었다는 그런 이야기를 합니다. 사교육이 폭발할 것 같다라는 의견이 있는데 어떻게 생각하냐 학생들한테 물으니까 적어도 쪽집게 고액 과외는 없어지겠지요. 그리고 단순 반복 문제풀이 학습지와 학원들은 없어지지 않을까요? 만약에 학원들이 변종을 하더라도 꺼내는 수업, 생각을 꺼내는 학원 이런 걸로 바뀌지 않겠습니까? 그런 이야기를 합니다. 무엇보다 학생들의 GPA 순서가 뒤바뀌었습니다. 여기 암기자라는 내신 1등급이 창의력은 7등급 이런 결과가 나왔습니다. 이걸 구체적으로 실험 결과를 보면요. 실제로 이게 여기 왼쪽이 다 내신 제일 낮은 등급이고요. 여기가 제일 높은 등급이지만 내신 하에서도 높은 아이들이 나오고 높은 데서도 낮은 아이들이 나옵니다. 그러니까 한국의 내신 성적이 여기서 높았다고 해서 여기서 창의력 시험에서 역시 높다는 보장이 없다는 것을 단적으로 드러내는 결과였고, 한국 공교육에서 내 아이가 생각은 좀 다양하게 많은 것 같은데 성적이 좀 안 나오는데 하는 그런 아이일 경우에, 학부모나 혹은 선생님들일 경우에 이게 사실은 얘가 김연아하고 박태환인지 모르는데 근데 올림픽 전 종목을 다 무시하고 달리기 하나로 줄 세워가지고 그러면 김연아와 박태환도 막 360등, 540등 이래가지고 아 나는 왜 이렇게 못하지? 무능하지? 이렇게 좌절시키는 교육 시스템이 지금 우리의 교육 시스템이지는 않는가라는 그런 반성을 해볼 필요가 있지 않나 생각을 해봅니다. 저는 교육은 물 만난 물고기를 만드는 거라고 생각합니다. 강물에서 잘 사는 물고기가 바닷물에 갖다 놓으면 숨을 제대로 못 쉽니다. 저는 물 만난 물고기를 만드는 이게 얼마나 중요하냐면 그 평가가 되게 중요한데 물고기를 헤엄치기가 아니라 나무 타기로 평가를 하면 자기가 너무나 무능하다고 생각하면서 살 거라고 아인슈타인이 얘기를 했습니다. 물 만난 물고기를 만들려면 집어넣는 교육이 아니라 꺼내는 교육을 해야 되고 결과가 아니라 과정을 가르치는 교육을 해야 되는데 우리는 사과나무에서 사과가 떨어지는 그 궁금함에서부터 만유인력이 나올 때까지 그런 과정을 경험하게 하기보다는 만유인력 법칙, E는 MC 제곱, F는 MA 이렇게 해서 그 결과들을 쫙 가르치면서 그게 왜냐하면 하면서 역으로 설명을 합니다. 이렇게 프로덕트를 먼저 가르치는 교육이 아니라 프로세스를 경험하게 하는 교육이어야 되고, 그리고 문제를 해결하는 주어진 조건에서 문제를 해결하라고 하는데 뭐가 어떨 때 무엇을 구하시오. 현실에서는 무엇이 어떨 때라는 존재라는 건 사실상 주어지지 않습니다. 산만성 펼쳐 있는 모든 곳에서 무엇이 조건인지조차 판단하는 것이 엄청난 능력이거든요. 그래서 문제를 발굴하는 능력, 그게 필요하고 지식의 소비자가 아니라 생산자를 기르는 교육이어야 된다라는 얘기를 하고요. 그다음에 현재의 오늘 계속 얘기 나오는 게 대부분의 직업이 없어진다는 얘기를 하지 않습니까? 그런데도 지금은 직업 탐색, 직업 탐방, 직업 훈련 교육을 합니다. 사실상 무모한 교육 준비라고 생각합니다. 왜냐하면 현존 직업 준비보다는 미래 직업을 창출할 수 있는 그런 교육을 해야 되지 않나 이런 생각이 듭니다. 최근에 제가 쓴 칼럼들 혹은 기사들 중에서 몇 가지 소개하겠습니다. 한국의 SAT, 한국 수능이 이제 창의성을 죽인다라는 그런 얘기였고요. 모두가 학위를 얘기하고 정말 교육은 얘기하지 않는다. 그리고 한국 교육은 생각하는 힘을 기르지 않고, 그리고 또 이제 국정교과서가 거민정 교과서하고 막 난리 치면서 싸울 때 제가 그럼 거민정은 답입니까? 거민정은 선입니까? 그런 질문을 하는 칼럼을 쓸 적이 있습니다. 거민정 교과서를 선택을 해도 어느 학생도 8개의 거민정 교과서를 비교 분석하면서 배우지 않습니다. 그 학교가 선택한 딱 하나의 교과서만 배우고요. 그리고 그 시험을 잘 보려면 처음부터 끝까지 다 외워야 됩니다. 거민정을 선택하든 국정을 선택하든 누구든 전쟁이 사회 변화를 가속화시킨다는 관점에 대해서 2시간 동안 써봐라 못 씁니다. 그래서 국정이든 거민정이든 주입식 회귀라 그리고 하나의 사관을 주입하는 한에서는 같은 프레임이라는 생각이 듭니다. 그리고 대선 교육 공약에 교육이 하나도 없고 복지만 있더라고요. 그냥 무상, 반가, 이거는 그냥 교육의 내용이 아니에요. 절대평가 이런 것도 절대평가가 몇 과목이 된들 아이가 같은 시험 문제를 풀면 전 과목이 절대평가가 된다고 한들 애가 같은 시험 문제를 풀면 결국은 같은 능력이 길러질 거고, 그러면 어제 오늘 얘기한 모든 포럼에서의 얘기는 다른 종류의 능력을 길러야 된다고 하는데 우리 애들은 같은 종류의 시험 문제를 푸는 한 다른 종류의 능력을 기를 수가 없습니다. 그러면 4차 산업혁명에 대비할 수 없습니다. 많은 사람들이 꺼내는 교육을 해야 된다, 그 다음에 4차 산업 대비하는 교육으로 가야 된다, 누구나 대부분 공감을 합니다. 문제는 채점의 공정성 때문에 객관식을 포기하지 못합니다. 근데 우리는 무엇이 진짜 공정인지, 그리고 채점의 공정에서 우리가 주장하는 게 그냥 단순히 재현 가능한 신뢰성만 보는 것은 아닌지, 타당성, 이 시대가 요구하는 타당성은 우리는 생각하고 있는 것인지, 그리고 구한말 때 근대화의 물결이 있었을 때도 이렇게 변해야 된다. 우리 지금 4차 산업혁명, 이것도 또 다른 물결이잖아요. 그렇게 변해야 된다 얘기하는 개화파가 있었지만 사실상 개화 쪽보다 압도적으로 많은 지지를 받았던 정책이 쇄국 정책이었습니다. 근데 그것도 백성들의 지지를 받았던 정책이었습니다. 저는 이 포럼에서 말씀하시는 많은 좋은 미래에 대한 인사이트, 그리고 정부에서 혹은 당국에서 교육을 생각하시는 그런 입장에 있으신 분들이 우연히 등대에 계셔서 등대 위에서 저 쓰나미가 몰려오는 것을 지켜보고 있는데, 그런데 등대 아래서 쓰나미가 오는 것을 잘 못 보는 국민들한테 그냥 국민들의 합의에 맞게 뜻에 알아서 거기서 합의해 보세요, 이런 얘기를 하고 이 쓰나미가 다가오는 것에 대해서 침묵을 지키는 것이야말로 이건 굉장히 무책임한 일이라고 생각을 합니다. 쓰나미가 오고 있는 것을 볼 수 있는 등대 위에 있는 사람들은 계속 사람들이 모두 다 들을 때까지 목소리를 내야 된다, 그런 생각을 합니다. 여기까지 하겠습니다. 감사합니다.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me. So I want to take a step back and think about what education is in the beginning. When you're born, there's no schools, there's no grades. As a baby, if you want to learn something, you have to try it. If you fail, you fall down, and recursively, as you try things again and again, you get a little bit better and more knowledgeable about what works and what doesn't. And over the course of time, school as we know it, that is to say, a primary, secondary, and tertiary system that has one teacher in front of a classroom, much like I'm doing right now, is a reasonably modern invention. I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about its development. I think that everyone has seen Ken Robinson's TED Talk at this point and has heard the story about why we designed schools to make people good at following directions. But as to the previous speaker's point, we've moved beyond a time where that is applicable and relevant. Moving from training someone to be a good manufacturer to training someone to be generative is a very hard thing to do, and lots of people are trying to do it. And overall, I'm optimistic that we're moving in the right direction. 7 years ago, when I started on college, I was pretty pessimistic that the system wasn't going to be able to change. And I've been really pleasantly surprised to see just how open and receptive people are, that they really want to solve the right problems. It's just that universities and education systems are big and slow-moving, and actually getting those to change and steer the course in the right direction is really, really hard. So primary and tertiary schooling became standard in the late 1800s, and then someone realizes that, oh, as we develop the economy, we need more education, and that truism has, I think, guided more of the development of education over the course of the last century and a half than really anything else. I think somewhere in the 1950s, most countries or states have a story about a leader who built or really expanded their country's education system. In California, where I'm from, that's Clark Kerr, who was the first head of the University of California system. And so we had these ideals, and there's a quote from Clark Kerr that I think really sums up how he went about building the University of California, which was, a university anywhere can aim no higher to be as British as possible for the sake of the undergraduates and as German as possible for the sake of the public at large, and as confused as possible for the preservation of the whole uneasy balance. So we had these different systems, a British and a German system, one research-based, one tutor-based. As the economy began to develop, economists came back to that old rhetoric of, if you want to build the economy, develop your educational system. And so we built a bunch more universities to enroll students, to learn whatever seemed relevant at the time. But somewhere in that process, as we started building more universities, we got lazy. We started copying systems that were working. We said, oh, well, to scale this process, we just need to build a bigger lecture hall, without thinking about what goes into that. What we're actually training students to do when they're trained to sit down and listen to a lecture, rather than engage in a problem that they care about, or are asked to work on a project with other students, or the fact that learning in a synchronous environment might not work the same because not everyone's going to learn the same things at the same speed. So I tell that story just to keep in mind sort of where we are in the global development of education. I think in the US, we've reached peak college enrollment. Over the last couple of years, enrollment in private colleges has actually started to decline. And I think that's one of the things that has really caused people to start to think cogently about what else might be out there and what the future looks like. Just yesterday, after I was speaking, I had someone come up and ask about starting a college in Korea. So you might be right that it's not so far off. Another statistic that I recently learned that I think is really telling in the global development of the story about where we are in education is that there are roughly 2.5 times the number of students enrolled in higher education in developing countries today compared to the year 2000. And that's a crazy number to think about. It's on the order of millions of students. And we've modeled in the developed world that the way to be successful is to build more colleges and teach higher skills, and everyone should get a bachelor's and then a master's and then a doctorate. And it's very unclear to me that that model is sustainable. And I think it's really good that we're engaging in a conversation now about how we can not repeat the mistakes of the past, and hope that we can give people who are countries that are just building their university systems an opportunity to do it better than we did, rather than just try and repeat the process. So the strategy of getting more and more students to go to college, it works, and it works pretty well in the US up until about a decade ago. And then you have 2008, you have a big financial crisis, you have a bunch of recent college graduates struggling to find jobs, and the grumbling begins. You start seeing newspaper articles about college graduates moving back in with their parents, and people are starting to realize that in the rush to get everyone to go to college, we forgot a couple of things. We forgot an emphasis on quality, we forgot an emphasis on outcomes, and we forgot an emphasis on cost. And this doesn't look exactly the same all over the world, but it happens roughly at the same time in the US. In the US, it's really characterized by the rise of student debt and college becoming increasingly cost prohibitive. In Germany, it's characterized by the limitation of students not being able to go to school indefinitely any longer. In the UK, they introduced tuition fees for the first time. So all over the world, this trend of countries realizing that that getting everyone to go to college is not necessarily going to work, is not going to work indefinitely, occurs at roughly the same time. In India, it's big companies like Infosys deciding to build their own educational programs when public institutions can't keep up with demand. For me, what this looked like when I was in college, starting college in the fall of 2010, was dropping out, moving back to San Francisco, and spending a few years bad-mouthing colleges and universities, trying to get a conversation started around what the future looks like. I've learned a lot of things since I was a dumb 19-year-old, but we all did silly things when we were 19. But what strikes me is both how right and how wrong I was. I was definitely on the right side of history that something needed to change. I didn't figure out a panacea or exactly the right way to do it, but it's been really enlightening and rewarding to be able to engage in that conversation over the course of the last 7 years. When I first dropped out, people would send me such nasty emails saying that higher education was never broken, and people would believe it indefinitely, and that their jobs were so secure that they didn't need to worry. And it's been really interesting to see the tenor of that conversation change over the course of the last couple of years. I think it was probably in 2014 when that conversation really changed for the first time. And that was the first year in the US that there had been an enrollment drop in private colleges for the second year in a row. And there were a couple of mid-tier colleges and universities that actually shut down and closed their doors due to financial insolvency. And that was really a wake-up call, I think, for the educators to say, oh, if we don't provide an education that's relevant and of quality and is focused on outcomes, we are not going to be able to survive unless we're Yale or Harvard and have a $40 billion endowment. If I'm a regular college and the vast majority of students do not go to elite schools, the ones that you can name off the tip of your tongue, you are very much revenue dependent. You depend on the tuition coming in, and that means that you have to think really intelligently, but also cyclically every year about who's coming and who wants to enroll and what the outcomes look like. So no one really quite agrees on how to fix what's going on, but I want to share a couple of tidbits about a couple of different types of programs that are going on in the US that I hope that you can take and learn and implement here in Korea. I'd say the problem in the US has primarily been focused on cost, in that it has become very expensive. It's been secondarily focused on outcomes, having students not being able to get the jobs that they wanted, and third, being focused on the fact that there's really only one system and hasn't been multiple pathways. So the dream that I had when I was 19 of being able to create a one-year program that would replace college definitely never came to fruition. Building an education system is really hard, and I have much more respect and understanding for those who work in universities now than I did before. I think one of my biggest takeaways, though, is that we conflate someone's growth and development and maturity and try and educate them at the same time. And there's a lot that needs to go on between the ages of 18 to 22 to understand who you are and how you learn and how you navigate the world. And we also say, oh, and by the way, we're going to train you for jobs at the same time. And if I could make one change overnight, it would be to separate those two things and have time explicitly focused on the growth and development, and then time focused on preparing for jobs. I think what is true more than ever is that the meta skills, things like self-awareness and self-control, will serve you more today than they ever did before, and that it's of utmost importance to be able to learn how to do something new rather than have an arsenal of skills that can pull out of your back pocket. If the thing that you're best at is that you can do things that you've never done before really well, you're going to be a lot more adaptable and flexible than your peers who just followed a straight path and passed the test, but can only regurgitate the information that they learned. At a macro level, I think one of the things that's really interesting is that we're seeing the balance of power in terms of innovation shift away from places that it's traditionally been held. My friend Jeremy Kestenbaum, who works at the Institute for the Future, likes to refer to this distinction as high velocity versus low velocity economies, and describes that the next big innovations will come out of Lagos, Nigeria, or Shenzhen, rather than coming from Silicon Valley or Tel Aviv. And as you think about how to adapt to an economy that is increasingly high velocity, that's increasingly decentralized, that's unfamiliar to the rigor and structure that we have been trained to operate with, I want to offer a few suggestions for us back in the developed world as we sit here thinking about this as to what I do to keep up. There's a company in the US called Trilogy that partners with schools, elite schools, to develop modern web boot camps to train schools on campus, because the schools can't innovate their curriculum fast enough to be able to keep up with industries. There's a college called Minerva that has built a framework around different types of skills to assess, that they have open sourced everything that they do and published a book about the process, And if I'm a professor, I want to go and read that book as fast as I can to understand what the new skills and competencies are that make sense to assess and teach. If I'm leading a technical team, there's a company called Andela that does a really wonderful job of building bridges between remote team members in Africa and embedding them in full-time technical teams at the world's largest companies in New York. They have they've worked with the who's who of companies, and the concept of being able to bridge talent across those gaps, I think, is really powerful. There's a company called Degreed, and if I'm a learning and development manager who's thinking about how to train my workforce for a high-velocity environment, I want to empower my team to learn as quickly as they can and use a program like that. And if I'm thinking about who to hire, I want to use something like Roykoi to hire actual diverse talent, because only having diverse talent will steer my business in the right direction in a world where the sources of revenue are coming from more and more diverse places. It's easy to look back and I think be nostalgic and think about education as a place that we went. And one of the reasons that I think it's taken a longer time to move this conversation around education forward is that everyone has an opinion about education. Everyone went to college, or everyone went to university, everyone has a child. And so it can be really hard to take a step back and think independently when you have such strong opinions and biases. And it's easy to be nostalgic and look back and say, oh, the days that my dad went to UC Berkeley for $200 a semester, were just 50 years ago. And sometimes it feels like the world is falling down around us, but overall, like I said, I'm really optimistic that we're on the right track. Yeah, it's exciting to have seen the changes over the course of the last 7 years and see where they're going. So I want to sum up with a few last points, and then I will leave the stage. Universities are changing their pricing by major. There's a program called Income Share Agreements that's launching in the US that is pricing programs by major so that students have a better idea of how much time it'll take to pay off their debt. More and more students are finding work on distributed work platforms like Upwork, and the traditional job as we know it is really changing. I don't want to get on the robots will take our jobs train, but there's definitely some truth to that. It's been really interesting to see the extent to which corporations are taking funding of education seriously, both developing their own internal corporate educational programs, but also committing funding to causes that matter. In the last month, we've seen Google commit to $50 million in CS funding, for example. And I think it's exciting to see corporations starting to take diversity seriously and realize that it actually really impacts the bottom line. Intel came out with a report at the beginning of this year that found that for every 1% increase in the diversity of their staff, there was a 3% increase in profit. So all in all, I'm optimistic about the way the world is heading, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
In today's presentation, I want to cover off 3 things. Firstly, the rise of internships and why they have become so important. Second, why unpaid internships are a problem for us all. And third, what good practice looks like. But first, what is an internship? I think it's important that we all understand what we're talking about, because this word internship can be used to mean quite different things in different companies and different countries, and often it isn't defined in law. An intern is often stereotyped as the person who makes tea or coffee for the office, but they're actually more likely to be doing the same work as other junior employees. Often the only thing that separates them is that title, intern. In fact, in Germany, 81% of interns stated that they were assigned tasks which were normally performed by regular staff. For the purposes of this discussion, I would define an internship as a relatively short period of informal, on-the-job training An internship usually involves the intern doing tangible work, not just shadowing an employer. And an intern is usually motivated by the hope of future employment. It's a means to an end, not the goal in itself. To be clear, an internship is not an apprenticeship too. Apprenticeships are much more formalized working relationships, which are often formulated in agreement with the educational institution and the employer. So why have internships become so valuable? I think this is because good internships often offer the employer and the intern quite a lot. First, there's the need for soft skills, which Dale spoke so eloquently about. In fact, Harvard found that 80% of achievements in one's career are determined by soft skills, and only 20% are determined by hard skills. And this value that employers place on soft skills, particularly that adaptability, will only increase as we adjust to this fourth industrial revolution that we're hearing so much about. Internships are the best way for young people to get real experience of the workplace skills that they will need so that they can be effective in a full-time role from day one. And this is particularly important given employers are offering less training than in the past, and young people are staying with employers for shorter periods of time. It's also the need to signal these skills, because it's not just attaining soft skills that matters, it's also that internships can be useful to signal to an employer and show that they are demonstrating that they are work ready. Third is the fact that businesses want to try before they buy. There is a limit to what you can understand from someone in a 45-minute interview. And internships offering perhaps, lasting perhaps a couple of months, show employers what a potential employee is really like. And it's not just employers who want to try before they buy, but young people do too. Because interns aren't just looking to gain skills, internships give young people the chance to try out a potential career path so that they can make a more informed choice before fully committing. And so now internships are an integral part of that university-to-work transition across many developed economies. For graduates, they have gone from being a nice-to-have to being a must-have. In the USA, 56% of graduating students had interned at least once before leaving university, and an even greater number will have interned before landing their first job. The European Commission estimates that in France and Germany, there are at least 1.5 million internships taking place each year, and as many as 5 million internships per year across the whole of the European Union. And these numbers are growing. There's been an increase. In the UK, for example, the number of interns has increased by 50% since 2010. As Hannah in Germany says, it doesn't matter how highly educated you are. If you want to get hired, you have to do internships. Or as the British think tank, the Institute for Public Policy Research found, and I quote, nearly half of employers reported that candidates who have not gained work experience through an internship will have little or no chance of receiving a job offer for their organization's graduate programs, regardless of academic qualifications. So it's understandable that internships have become more important. But given that they are so important, it's really important that they are high quality and affordable. And this is why the fact that so many internships are unpaid is a real problem for all of us. Because if internships are unpaid, then these opportunities cease to become offered purely on the basis of merit, but rather on the basis of parental wealth. As a result, unpaid internships can act as barriers that cut out the vast majority of young people who can't afford to work for free for months on end. Because the cost of doing an unpaid internship is significant. They can last for many months, and sometimes for as long as a year, and often involve relocating from someone's hometown to a major city. It may not even be the only internship that they take. I've spoken to people who have spent years of their lives interning. One woman I met had done 5 unpaid internships before she landed her first job. Now, in the European Union, an average internship lasts for 4 months. This isn't just 4 months without pay. but 4 months with a range of extra costs like housing. In the UK, a country which, like South Korea, has an economy centred on one very big capital city, one think tank calculated that it costs about $8,000, or just under 9 million won, to do an unpaid internship in London. Now, this is money that most young people simply don't have, and this represents a problem for society. Now, polling from the UK, sorry to mention the UK again, shows that 3/4 of people believe that they or someone from a family like theirs could not afford to do an unpaid internship in London. Only 4% of people were sure that they could do it. 2 in 5 British people who were offered an internship have turned it down for financial reasons. Young people doing unpaid internships are often put in a vulnerable position. They are interning in order to get a full-time job, which means they can often be exploited in the workplace. We have heard stories of interns who are working round the clock for no pay or performing tasks which are totally unrelated to the job in hand, like cleaning out the office toilets, because they were so desperate for a full-time job, or at the very least, a good reference on their resume. What's more, many interns are strung along for month after month, being told that they might get paid if only they hang around that little bit longer. This is bad for those young people, but it's also a problem for their parents. I've spoken to parents who feel devastated that they have let their kids down. They say they've told their children to play by the rules, work hard at school and get to a good university, and then you'll be able to land a job. However, they're finding out age 20 or 21 that actually they need to do more than that. They also need to be able to afford to be unpaid interns. Many parents can't afford to subsidize their kids for this final period and can't bear the guilt that comes with feeling that they have failed to give their children a good head start. But this is not just a moral issue, because unpaid internships also represent a problem for businesses. Now, this happens for several reasons. First, access to talent. Internships have become a key way to recruit. For example, more than half of investment banking recruits at Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley come via their intern programs. Research shows that employers who pay their interns are more likely to recruit them. 46% of employers who paid their interns found this a useful method of recruitment, compared to just 32% for those who had unpaid internship schemes. So I think it's short-sighted here to limit the talent pool. Unpaid interns are much more likely to be from affluent backgrounds, and depending on the country, may also be from certain ethnicities or geographies. This is a problem, because research shows, as we've heard already, that diverse workforces perform better. A recent McKinsey report on 366 public companies found that diverse companies were performing substantially better than the industry averages. I think this is unsurprising, as these companies are able to draw on more talents. But new research also shows that, as Harvard Business Review has found, that diverse teams are simply smarter. Working with people who are different from you may challenge your brain to overcome its stale ways of thinking and sharpen its performance. So it's not just that you're broadening the talent pool, but it's that having diverse workforces actually challenge each other to perform better. Now, conversely, when you don't pay someone for work, nepotism becomes more likely. An analysis by the New York Times of 1,500 unpaid interns in the office of Michael Bloomberg, who had been recommended by someone in the administration. Internships can even be bought and sold. America's Washington Center has placed nearly 50,000 interns since 1975 and charges $6,200 for a 10-week summer position. It says it's placed clients in the Treasury and the White House. Dream Careers says it has sold more than 13,000 internships in firms like Standard & Poor's. Fees for its 8-week internships start at $8,000. I think it's obvious that businesses will not be well served if people can literally buy their way into a company. Also, it's not just about access to talent, but also access to new ideas. Because for businesses to stay competitive, they need new energy and fresh ideas. Interns in many companies provide that stimulus while they're there. And so again, it doesn't make sense to limit yourself to people from one socioeconomic background. But paying interns isn't just an opportunity for companies. By not paying interns, companies can open themselves up to reputational threats. In many countries, and I'll be interested to hear your perspective on South Korea, but in many countries, the public have become openly hostile to unpaid internships. Polling in Britain shows that 85% of the public believe that interns should be paid, and just 2% believe that they should not be paid. In countries including Canada, France, and Australia, businesses using unpaid interns have been exposed to protests, which have led to embarrassing newspaper headlines and forced them to change practice. Unpaid internships can also represent a big legal headache, because they often fall under a legally grey area where they are actually often illegal. Because internships are a relatively recent phenomenon in many countries, this type of arrangement is often uncategorized under employment law. This means that if an intern meets the legal tests for being a worker or an employee, they are entitled to the minimum wage. These tests can include factors like whether the person is contributing value to that organization and whether they are expected to turn up on time. Where interns have legally challenged their employers for payment, and we've helped some to do so, they have usually been successful. And companies including Fox Searchlight Pictures in the USA and Sony in the UK have paid their interns following legal action. For governments, these challenges can create economic and social issues too. Because unpaid internships are unaffordable for so many people, they increase the likelihood of a skills mismatch taking place, with many capable people being locked out of career paths that they would be well suited for. And in the long term, this can have a very harmful effect on our economies. Second, because unpaid internships give a leg up to those people who already had more advantages and act as a barrier from those from less affluent backgrounds, they accelerate inequality. And third, because they represent a new cost for young people looking to enter the labour market, they contribute to the intergenerational inequality that affects many of our societies. So if these are the challenges with unpaid internships, then what does best practice look like? Interns should be paid a wage that allows them to live, but it doesn't need to be big bucks necessarily. Beyond that, we believe that an ideal internship will vary from industry to industry. What works in a global bank might not be the same as in a newspaper, but there are general principles about what makes a good internship that delivers value to both the intern and the employer. I'm going to work through just at each stage what good practice looks like. So at the recruitment stage, employers should try to widen the net for recruitment as far as possible. Apple is an example of a company that does this really well. It goes to university campuses, organizes hackathons, and advertises online. And the process should, for recruitment, be broadly similar to the approach that companies take for regular employees, with proper, rigorous, thought-out process given to how the skills and qualifications of the intern fit with the tasks they will be expected to fill. Job advertisements should give a clear indication of how long the internship will last, and at interview, the intern should be told honestly whether there is a real chance of obtaining a full-term contract. Good internship schemes should provide that opportunity for full-term employment for people who do well. I think unlike in normal recruitment, employers should focus on interviewing for skills, like analytical skills or teamwork, rather than just for experience, as interns are such an early stage of their careers. Second, so at the start of the program, at the induction, interns should receive a proper induction to the organization they enter to allow them to fully integrate. Whether you're joining a large organization or a small business, an intern just entering the job market may find the workplace intimidating. So it makes sense to set up a program of meetings with staff in the company to enable them to hit the ground running during the internship. So just like your other employees, good management and supervision will make the intern more productive and develop more quickly. Organisations should ensure that there's a dedicated person who has ring-fenced time in their work schedule to supervise the intern and conduct regular performance reviews. For example, at Google, interns get a weekly 30-minute to an hour session with their mentor to discuss their plans and progress. Now, this mentor or manager should provide ongoing feedback to the intern, be their advocate over the period of the internship, and at the end of it, to conduct a formal performance review to evaluate the success of their time. Finally, when you leave the internship, organisations should be providing interns with that reference letter that details the work they've undertaken, the skills and experience they've acquired, and the content of the formal performance review conducted at the end of the internship. I think interns should also be given the opportunity to feedback on their own experience at the exit interview, giving the organisation that opportunity to reflect on its own performance in delivering internships. As I said, good internships at larger organisations will also be thinking maybe about hiring those interns who perform well in roles. But beyond individual employers, what more can be done to move towards a system of high-quality paid internships? For governments, I think governments shouldn't be over-regulating internships out of existence. It's not their responsibility to determine best practice or interfere with the day-to-day running of internship programs, but they should introduce smart regulation to cut out the long-term unpaid internships that harm society in the long run, our economy as well. France and Germany have already set limits to the length of unpaid internships, and Canada has banned unpaid internships in federally regulated sectors of the economy. In Britain, we are calling for a 4-week limit to unpaid internships. This proposal, which is currently going through our Parliament, would allow short-term unpaid work to continue while stopping unaffordable long-term unpaid internships. To be clear, it would allow the kind of work shadowing where you're just kind of going and getting a feel of an employer to continue, but not these kind of very long-term unpaid positions. Interestingly, when polled on these proposals, 2/3 of British businesses actually supported them, in part because this policy would provide small and medium-sized businesses with real legal clarity about what the law is. I think this is important also, that our research also showed that the proposals would not lead to an overall reduction in the number of internships. I think this model comes about from campaigning from groups like ours in the UK, but also around the world, and I'm sure that there will be opportunities for a similar thing to happen in Korea if there's a similar feeling here. But it's not just about governments, it's also about industry level employers taking action, because employers can work together to develop guidelines for best practice, which tends to improve the quality of internships. So in the UK, we've worked with a range of industry groups representing everything from accountancy to music and public relations to develop guidelines for their members' HR departments. I think this approach would work well in other countries too and would help to raise the standards of internships. I'll end by saying that unpaid internships are a relatively new problem. I'm confident that enlightened employers and smart, far-sighted governments can, by working together, bring about a fairer, better system. They owe it to the next generation and themselves. Thank you for listening. I look forward to your questions.
Good job.